The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Officer Ryan Kramer shoved the handcuffed nurse against the wall, his badge gleaming under the harsh ER lights of Riverside General Hospital. "You're nothing," he hissed, loud enough for the entire trauma bay to hear. "Just another bleeding heart who thinks she matters." Sarah Mitchell didn't flinch. Her hand stayed steady even as hospital security looked away, even as her colleagues pretended not to see. What Kramer didn't know, what nobody in that room knew, was that the woman he was humiliating had spent 3 years pulling dying soldiers from burning vehicles in Kandahar. And in less than 2 hours, when federal agents stormed through those same doors with weapons drawn and a convoy of casualties screaming down the highway, everyone would learn exactly who Sarah Mitchell really was. Before we dive into Sarah's story, I want to invite you to stay with me until the very end. If this story grabs you, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel across the world. The rain came down in sheets across Riverside, turning the streets into rivers of reflected neon and washing the blood from the sidewalks faster than the city could produce it. Inside Riverside General Hospital, the emergency department hummed with its usual Tuesday night chaos, drunks sobering up in hallway beds, a grandmother with chest pain waiting for a cardiologist who wouldn't arrive for another hour, and a gunshot wound being prepped for surgery while 2 patrol officers stood guard outside the trauma room. Sarah Mitchell moved through it all with the kind of efficiency that came from repetition, not passion. She'd been at Riverside General for 8 months now, long enough to know which doctors threw instruments when they got frustrated, and which nurses hoarded the good IV catheters in their pockets. Long enough to recognize the particular rhythm of a Tuesday night in a Level 2 trauma center that serviced the rougher parts of the city. She wasn't supposed to be here tonight. Her shift had ended at 7, but Jamie Chen had called in sick, actually sick this time, not hungover, and Sarah had picked up the overtime without complaint. The extra money helped, and the alternative was going home to her 1-bedroom apartment where the refrigerator made a grinding noise she couldn't afford to fix, and the upstairs neighbor practiced drums until midnight. "Sarah, I need you in 4, Dr. Marcus Webb called from across the nurses' station. He was in his 50s, competent but tired, the kind of physician who'd stopped caring about anything except his pension and his boat. "Police custody case. Probable overdose. Just keep an eye on him while we wait for labs." She grabbed a clipboard and pushed through the curtain into Bay 4. The patient was a young man, maybe 25, handcuffed to the bed rail and barely conscious. His breathing was shallow, pupils pinpoint. Classic opioid presentation. Standing on the other side of the bed was Officer Ryan Kramer. Sarah had dealt with Kramer before. Everyone at Riverside General had dealt with Kramer. He was 38, built like a linebacker, and had the kind of face that looked perpetually angry even in repose. He wore his authority like armor, and he'd built a reputation in the department as someone who got results. What that actually meant was that suspects in his custody tended to have a lot of unexplained bruises. "About time," Kramer said when Sarah entered. "This piece of garbage has been whining for 20 minutes. Sarah moved to the patient's side, checking his pulse and respiratory rate. The young man's wrists were raw where the handcuffs dug into skin. "When did he lose consciousness?" "He's faking," Kramer said dismissively, "playing it up for sympathy." Sarah pulled out her pen light and checked the patient's pupils again. They didn't react. "He's not faking. His respiratory rate is dropping. When was he arrested?" "That's not your concern." "It is if he stops breathing in my ER." Sarah reached for the call button. "I need to page Dr. Webb." Kramer's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. "You don't page anyone. You do your job and keep your mouth shut." Sarah looked down at his hand, then up at his face. Her voice stayed level. "Let go of me." For a moment, neither of them moved. The monitor beeped steadily in the background. The patient's breathing rattled in his chest. Then Kramer released her wrist and stepped back, a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. "Sensitive," he said. "I like that." Sarah pressed the call button. Dr. Webb appeared 2 minutes later, assessed the situation, and ordered Narcan. The patient came around gasping and confused, and Kramer immediately started questioning him in a voice loud enough to disturb the other bays. Sarah documented everything she saw, the bruising on the patient's ribs that didn't match the arrest report, the defensive wounds on his forearms, the way he flinched every time Kramer moved. She'd been documenting things like this for months. Nothing ever came of it. An hour later, Sarah was restocking supplies in the medication room when Kramer appeared in the doorway. He didn't say anything at first, just leaned against the frame and watched her work. The room suddenly felt very small. "You got a problem with how I do my job?" he asked finally. Sarah continued counting gauze packages. "I document what I observe. That's my job." "Your job is to patch up whoever we bring in and keep your opinions to yourself." He took a step into the room. "You seem to have trouble understanding that." "I understand it fine." "Do you?" Another step closer. "Because from where I'm standing, you seem to think you're something special, above the rest of us." Sarah turned to face him directly. She was 5'6". He had 8 inches and 80 pounds on her. "I think patients deserve competent medical care regardless of why they're here. If that makes me special, I'll take it." Kramer's jaw tightened. "You know what I think? I think you're one of those nurses who watch too much TV and thinks she's going to save the world. But this isn't TV, sweetheart. This is the real world. And in the real world, people like you don't matter." "Then why are you so bothered by me?" It was the wrong thing to say. She knew it the moment the words left her mouth. Kramer's face darkened, and he took another step forward, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath. "You want to play games?" His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I can play games. I know people in administration. I know people in the union. One word from me, and you'll be lucky to find work at a veterinary clinic." The door opened behind him. Kelly Rodriguez, one of the other night shift nurses, stood in the hallway with an armful of linens. She looked between Sarah and Kramer, her expression carefully neutral. "Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt," Kelly said. "Sarah, we need you at the desk. Ambulance incoming." Kramer stepped back, his professional mask sliding back into place. "We'll continue this conversation later," he said, then brushed past Kelly and disappeared into the hallway. Kelly waited until his footsteps faded before speaking. "You okay?" "Fine." "Sarah, I'm fine, Kelly. What's the ambulance?" Kelly hesitated, then let it drop. "Motor vehicle accident. 2 patients, both stable." The rest of the shift passed without incident. Kramer hung around for another hour, making his presence felt, then left with his prisoner once the lab work came back and the patient was cleared for booking. Sarah finished her charting, gave report to the day shift, and drove home through streets still wet from the morning rain. She didn't sleep well. She never did anymore. The next shift started the same as always. Sarah arrived 15 minutes early, got her assignment from the charge nurse, and checked her patients. Bay 7 had a middle-aged woman with abdominal pain. Bay 2 had a teenager with a sprained ankle. Bay 5 was empty, waiting. By 8 p.m., the department was filling up. A car accident brought in 3 patients at once. A construction worker came in with a nail through his hand. An elderly man arrived by ambulance with altered mental status. Sarah moved between them all, starting IVs, drawing labs, administering medications, documenting everything in the computer system that crashed twice an hour. At 9:30, Kramer walked in with another prisoner. This one was different. Female, mid-20s, brought in for medical clearance before booking. The arrest report was vague: resisting arrest, assault on an officer, possession of controlled substances. The woman was silent, her face swollen on one side, her right eye nearly shut. She sat in the wheelchair with her hands cuffed in front of her, staring at nothing. Sarah took one look at her and felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Bay 8, the charge nurse said. "Get her cleared fast. They want her processed tonight." Sarah wheeled the woman into the bay. Kramer followed, positioning himself between the patient and the door. Sarah helped the woman onto the bed, noting the defensive wounds on her arms, the bruising around her throat that looked like finger marks, the way she moved like everything hurt. "I need to examine her," Sarah said to Kramer. "You'll have to wait outside." "I'm not going anywhere." "She's in custody, not under arrest anymore. Hospital policy says—" "I don't care about hospital policy." Kramer crossed his arms. "She's a flight risk and potentially violent. I stay." Sarah pulled out her phone and texted the charge nurse. 2 minutes later, Tom Bradley, the nursing supervisor, appeared. He was 6'4", former military, and one of the few people in the hospital who didn't seem intimidated by Kramer. "Officer, I need you to step outside while we conduct the examination," Tom said pleasantly. "Not happening." It's hospital policy. You can wait right outside the curtain. I said no. Kramer's hand moved to his belt, resting on his radio. This prisoner is my responsibility. She doesn't get examined unless I'm in the room. Tom looked at Sarah, then back at Kramer. The moment stretched out. Finally, Tom nodded. Fine, but you stand by the door and you don't interfere. It wasn't a victory, but it was something. Kramer moved to the corner and Sarah began her assessment. The woman, her name was listed as Diana Price on the intake form, didn't speak. She answered Sarah's questions with tiny nods or shakes of her head. Yes, she had pain. No, she didn't want medication. Yes, she understood where she was. Sarah documented bruising, lacerations, swelling. She documented the finger-shaped marks on Diana's throat and the defensive wounds on her forearms. She documented everything she could see and several things she suspected but couldn't prove. When Dr. Webb came in to complete the medical clearance, he spent 90 seconds looking at the patient before signing off on the paperwork. She's good to go, he told Kramer. Wait, Sarah said. She needs imaging. That facial swelling? It's just bruising, Webb said without looking up from his tablet. She's medically clear. Dr. Webb, I really think I said she's clear, Sarah. He met her eyes for the first time. Don't make this complicated. Sarah felt every eye in the bay on her. Kramer watching, Tom watching, Diana watching from the bed with that one good eye. She thought about pushing it, thought about all the documentation she'd done over the past 8 months and how none of it had ever mattered. Then she thought about something else. I need to speak with you privately, Dr. Webb, she said. Webb sighed but followed her out of the bay, far enough away that Kramer couldn't hear. What? That patient has injuries consistent with strangulation. By law, we're required to report suspected assault. She was arrested for assaulting an officer. The injuries are from the arrest. It's documented in the police report. The police report says she was violent and resisted arrest. It doesn't explain the finger marks on her throat or the defensive wounds that suggest... Sarah, Webb's voice hardened. You're a good nurse. You work hard, you show up on time, and you don't complain about overtime. But you need to understand something. We're not investigators. We're not lawyers. We treat patients and we document what we see, but we don't make judgments about how they got hurt. That's not our job. Our job is to advocate for patients who can't advocate for themselves. Our job is to keep this ER running and not get sued. He glanced back toward Bay 8. That officer has been bringing patients here for 10 years. He's got friends in the department, friends in City Hall. You want to make an enemy of him over some junkie who assaulted a cop? Sarah felt something shift inside her, something she'd been keeping carefully locked away since she'd left the service. So we just ignore it. We document it and we move on. That's how this works. Webb started to walk away, then paused. And Sarah? I'd be very careful about making waves right now. Budget cuts are coming. The hospital's looking to reduce nursing staff. It would be a shame if your name ended up on that list. He left her standing in the hallway, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and the smell of antiseptic thick in the air. Sarah stood there for a long moment, then walked back to Bay 8. Kramer was already wheeling Diana toward the exit. The woman's head was down, her shoulders hunched. As they passed, Diana looked up and met Sarah's eyes. There was no hope in that look, no expectation of rescue, just recognition. One woman acknowledging another woman's powerlessness. Sarah watched them disappear through the ambulance bay doors. Then she went back to her other patients. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of shifts. Sarah showed up, did her job, went home. She stopped documenting unusual bruising on patients in police custody. She stopped questioning arrest reports that didn't match injury patterns. She kept her head down and her mouth shut. Kelly noticed. "You okay?" she asked one night during their break. "You've been quiet." "I'm fine." "You sure? Because you seem..." "I said I'm fine, Kelly." Kelly didn't push it. Nobody pushed anything at Riverside General. That was how you survived. On a Thursday night, 3 weeks after the incident with Diana Price, Sarah was working triage when Kramer walked in again. This time, he didn't have a prisoner. He just stood at the nurse's station, chatting with one of the security guards, drinking coffee from a paper cup. Waiting. Sarah felt his eyes on her every time she walked past. He didn't say anything, didn't do anything, just watched, making his presence known, reminding her that he could be there whenever he wanted, that this was his territory, that she existed in it only at his pleasure. At midnight, Tom Bradley pulled her aside. "Administration wants to see you tomorrow. 10 a.m. "What for?" "Didn't say, just said it was important." He paused. "Sarah, if there's something going on that I should know about..." "There's nothing going on." But they both knew that was a lie. Sarah spent the rest of her shift wondering what was coming. A reprimand for questioning Dr. Webb? A formal complaint from Kramer? When her shift ended at 7 a.m., she didn't go home. She couldn't face the empty apartment, couldn't face the silence. Instead, she drove to a diner on the east side and ordered coffee she didn't drink while watching the sunrise through rain-streaked windows. At 9:45, she walked into Riverside General's administrative offices on the 3rd floor. The carpet was nicer here, the walls decorated with framed photos of the hospital's founding physicians and plaques commemorating various donations and achievements. The secretary told her to wait. At 10:15, she was called into an office where Linda Morrison, the director of nursing, sat behind a mahogany desk with a file folder open in front of her. Morrison was 52, impeccably dressed, and had worked her way up from bedside nursing to administration over 25 years. She didn't smile when Sarah entered. "Sit down, Ms. Mitchell." Sarah sat. Morrison folded her hands on top of the file. "We've received several complaints about your conduct over the past month. Complaints from a police officer who frequently brings patients to this facility, complaints from Dr. Webb regarding insubordination, and complaints from other nursing staff about your attitude." "What complaints from other nursing staff?" "That's not relevant right now. What's relevant is a pattern of behavior that suggests you're having difficulty working as part of a team." Morrison pulled a paper from the file. "You questioned a physician's medical clearance decision in front of a patient and a police officer. You've made unauthorized notations in patient charts suggesting police misconduct. You've created a hostile work environment by refusing to cooperate with law enforcement personnel." Each accusation landed like a physical blow. Sarah felt her hands tightening on the arms of the chair. "I documented my clinical observations. That's my responsibility as a nurse." "Your responsibility is to provide patient care within the scope of your practice and to maintain professional relationships with all members of the healthcare team, including law enforcement." Morrison's voice was clipped, professional, utterly devoid of sympathy. "You seem to have forgotten that." "I haven't forgotten anything. I've been doing my job." "You've been doing what you think your job is, which isn't the same thing." Morrison closed the file. "I'm suspending you for 1 week, pending a full investigation into your conduct. During that time, you will not enter hospital property. You will not contact other staff members about ongoing cases, and you will not discuss this matter with anyone outside the administration. When you return, you'll be placed on probationary status. Any further complaints will result in termination. Do you understand?" Sarah understood perfectly. Kramer had made good on his threat. He'd found his leverage, pulled his strings, and now she was being pushed out for the crime of caring too much. "I understand," she said quietly. "Good. Surrender your badge to security on your way out." Sarah stood. She thought about arguing, thought about fighting, thought about all the things she could say that wouldn't make any difference. Then she thought about Diana Price's eyes in that hospital bay, resigned and hopeless. She left the office without another word. By noon, she was home. By 1 p.m., she'd stopped crying. By 3 p.m., she was sitting on her couch staring at her phone, wondering if 8 months at Riverside General had been worth anything at all. The answer came at 6 p.m. in the form of a news alert on her phone. Breaking: Federal transport convoy attacked on Highway 47, multiple casualties, developing story. Sarah pulled up the news feed. Details were scarce. Some kind of explosion on the Eastern Highway, just outside city limits. Federal vehicles involved. Casualties being transported to local hospitals. Her phone rang. It was Tom Bradley. "Sarah, I know you're suspended, but we need you. Now. Mass casualty event. Every available nurse is being called in." "I'm suspended, Tom." Morrison said, "Morrison isn't here, and I'm the supervisor on duty. We've got federal casualties incoming with security escorts, and we're completely overwhelmed. I need experienced trauma nurses, and I need them 10 minutes ago." Sarah was already grabbing her keys. "I'm on my way." She made it to the hospital in 8 minutes, parked illegally in the ambulance bay, and ran through the ER entrance. The scene inside was controlled chaos. Every bay was full or filling, nurses were running, doctors were shouting orders. And through the main entrance, a steady stream of ambulances was unloading patients while men in tactical gear secured the perimeter. Tom saw her and pointed toward Trauma 1. Adult male, multiple GSWs, hypotensive. Get him stabilized. Sarah didn't stop to think. She ran. The patient was already on the table, his tactical vest cut away, blood everywhere. 2 other nurses were working on him, but they were fumbling, moving too slow, not working as a team. Sarah assessed the situation in seconds, the way she'd been trained to do in a very different place, under very different circumstances. Pressure on that wound, she snapped at the younger nurse. You, get me 2 large-bore IVs and start running fluids wide open. Someone page surgery and tell them we're coming up in 5 minutes, whether they're ready or not. The nurses stared at her. Sarah had never given orders like that before, had never used that tone. But something had shifted. The careful mask she'd been wearing for 8 months was gone. Move, she barked. And they moved. She worked on instinct, her hands steady as she placed lines and managed bleeding and called out vitals in the clipped, efficient language of combat medicine. Dr. Webb appeared at some point, started to say something, then just stepped back and let her work. Within 6 minutes, the patient was stable enough for transport. Get him to OR1, Sarah said, then moved to the next bay before anyone could respond. The next patient was a woman in her 40s with shrapnel wounds and a pneumothorax. Sarah placed a chest tube with the kind of confidence that made the attending physician raise his eyebrows. Then another patient. Then another. She lost track of time, lost track of how many people she treated. She just moved from bay to bay, bringing order to chaos, her training taking over in a way it hadn't been allowed to in 8 months of routine ER nursing. At some point, she became aware that people were watching her, not just the staff, but the federal agents and tactical operators who'd come in with the casualties. They stood at the edges of the trauma bays, observing her work with expressions she couldn't read. Sarah was stabilizing her 6th patient when she heard a voice behind her. Lieutenant Mitchell? She froze. Nobody at Riverside General knew that name. Nobody in this city knew that name. She'd left it behind 3 years ago when she'd mustered out of the service and tried to build a normal life. Sarah turned slowly. Standing in the trauma bay entrance, still in full tactical gear, was Colonel Marcus Flynn. He looked exactly the same as he had the last time she'd seen him, standing over a field hospital table in Kandahar, while Sarah worked to save his team after their convoy hit an IED. Colonel, she said quietly. The room had gone silent. Every nurse, every doctor, every federal agent was watching. Flynn stepped forward and saluted. Good to see you still have those hands, Lieutenant. Sarah didn't return the salute. She hadn't been Lieutenant Mitchell in 3 years. She was just Sarah now, just a nurse trying to pay rent and not think too hard about the things she'd seen. But Flynn wasn't looking at just Sarah. He was looking at the woman who'd once spent 22 hours straight performing battlefield medicine in a tent that was taking mortar fire. The woman who'd taught herself to intubate patients while wearing body armor and who'd once held pressure on a severed femoral artery for 40 minutes because there was no one else to do it. We need to talk, Flynn said. Privately. Before Sarah could respond, Officer Ryan Kramer pushed his way into the trauma bay. He must have been called in for the mass casualty event, must have been somewhere in the hospital the whole time. He looked between Sarah and Flynn, his expression darkening. She's suspended, Kramer announced loudly. She's not supposed to be here. I want her removed from this hospital immediately. Flynn didn't even glance at him. Who are you? Officer Ryan Kramer, Riverside PD. This woman is suspended pending investigation for... I didn't ask for your life story, officer. I asked who you are. Flynn's voice was pleasant, but his eyes were cold. Because from where I'm standing, you're interrupting a conversation with a decorated combat medic who just saved the lives of 4 of my people. Kramer's face flushed. I don't care if she's Florence Nightingale. She was ordered off hospital property by hospital administration, not by federal authority. Flynn pulled something from his pocket and held it up. A badge Sarah recognized, FBI. And as of right now, this entire facility is under federal jurisdiction while we investigate an attack on a federal convoy. So unless you have something useful to contribute, I suggest you step outside." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Kramer looked like he wanted to argue, but even he wasn't stupid enough to challenge an FBI colonel in front of witnesses. He glared at Sarah with pure hatred, then turned and stalked out of the trauma bay. Flynn watched him go, then turned back to Sarah. "Make some enemies, Lieutenant?" "I'm not a lieutenant anymore, Colonel. Haven't been for 3 years." "Once a combat medic, always a combat medic." He gestured toward the hallway. "Now, we really do need to talk, because one of my wounded is asking for you specifically, and I need to understand why." Sarah followed him through the ER, past staring nurses and confused doctors, into a private consultation room. Flynn closed the door and turned to face her. "Agent David Price," he said. "One of my people. He recognized you immediately. Said you treated his sister here about 3 weeks ago. Diana Price. Do you remember her?" The name hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. Diana. The woman with the finger-shaped bruises on her throat. The woman she'd failed. "I remember," Sarah said carefully. "She's dead, Lieutenant. Died in custody 2 weeks ago. Officially ruled a suicide. Agent Price doesn't believe it." Flynn's eyes were sharp, assessing. "He seems to think you documented injuries that suggested something else." Sarah's heart was pounding. "I documented what I saw. My supervising physician cleared her for booking. That was the end of my involvement." "Was it?" Flynn pulled out a tablet and brought up a file. "Because according to Agent Price, you were the only person in that ER who seemed to give a damn that his sister was being abused by the officer who arrested her. The same officer who just tried to have you thrown out of this hospital." The pieces were starting to come together. Sarah thought about Kramer's reaction when Flynn mentioned Diana, the way he'd gone pale before the anger took over. "What are you investigating, Colonel?" "That's classified. But I will tell you this much. Diana Price was a federal witness in a corruption investigation. She was arrested on false charges by an officer who knew exactly who she was. And now she's dead." Flynn leaned against the desk. "Agent Price thinks you have documentation that could prove his sister was murdered. Is he right?" Sarah thought about the notation she'd made in Diana's chart, the careful clinical language she'd used to document injuries that told a very different story than the arrest report. Documentation that doctor Webb had told her to forget about. Documentation that might have gotten Diana killed. "I documented my clinical observations," Sarah said. "Everything else is speculation." "Speculation that might save lives." Flynn studied her face. "How many other patients has Officer Kramer brought to this hospital, Lieutenant? How many other people has he hurt?" "Too many." The answer was too many, and Sarah had been keeping count for 8 months. She was about to respond when the door burst open and Tom Bradley appeared, his face pale. "Sarah, we have a problem. Morrison just arrived. She's with hospital security, and she's demanding that you be arrested for trespassing, and Officer Kramer is backing her up." Flynn straightened from the desk, his hand moving automatically to the weapon at his hip. The shift in his posture was subtle, but Sarah caught it. The same coiled readiness she'd seen in soldiers who'd spent too long in hostile territory. Tom stood in the doorway looking like he wanted to be anywhere else, his radio crackling with chatter from the ER. "Tell Morrison I'll be out in 2 minutes," Sarah said. "Sarah, she's not asking. She's got hospital security with her, and Kramer's telling them you're interfering with a police investigation." 2 minutes, Tom." He hesitated, then disappeared back into the hallway. The door swung shut, and Sarah turned to find Flynn watching her with that same assessing look he'd given her in Kandahar when she'd told him she could save his men if he could buy her time. "You're in trouble," Flynn said. It wasn't a question. "I've been in trouble since I documented Diana Price's injuries and didn't keep my mouth shut about them." Sarah's voice was steady, but her hands were shaking now, the adrenaline from the trauma bay finally catching up with her. "Officer Kramer has friends. Apparently so does he." "Diana's brother doesn't have friends. He has a federal investigation and a dead sister." Flynn pulled out his phone and typed something quickly. "How many patients are we talking about? How many times has Kramer brought in someone who looked like they'd been worked over?" Sarah thought about the documentation she'd kept, the careful notes she'd made in charts that nobody ever read. 15 that I can confirm. Probably more that came in on shifts I wasn't working. 15. Flynn's jaw tightened, and nobody said anything. People said plenty, they just said it quietly and to each other, not to anyone who could do anything about it. The bitterness in Sarah's voice surprised even her. That's how it works here, Colonel. You keep your head down, you do your job, you don't make waves, because if you make waves, you end up like me, suspended and about to be arrested for trespassing while the guy who's been beating suspects for years walks around like he owns the place. Flynn was quiet for a moment. Outside the door, Sarah could hear raised voices. Morrison's crisp administrative tone cutting through the ER noise, demanding to know where the suspended nurse had gone. Kramer's deeper voice backing her up, adding fuel to the fire. You still have access to those charts? Flynn asked. I'm suspended. They locked me out of the system before I even left the building yesterday. But the charts still exist. Sarah understood what he was asking. They exist. Whether anyone will let you see them is another question. Hospital administration tends to get protective when outside agencies start asking questions about potential liability. Let me worry about administration. Flynn moved toward the door, then paused. Lieutenant, I need to know. Are you willing to testify about what you saw? Because if we're going to pursue this, if we're going to build a case that Diana Price was murdered and that Officer Kramer has been systematically abusing people in custody, I need witnesses who won't fold the first time a lawyer gets aggressive. It was the question Sarah had been avoiding for 8 months. The question that had kept her awake at night after every shift where she'd documented something suspicious and then watched it get buried under paperwork and administrative indifference. She thought about Diana's eyes in that hospital bay, hopeless and resigned. She thought about the teenager with the sprained ankle who'd flinched every time Kramer walked past. She thought about all the people she'd failed because she'd been too afraid to do more than write careful notes and charts nobody cared about. I'll testify, she said. Flynn nodded once, then opened the door and stepped into the hallway. Sarah followed him out into chaos. The ER had transformed in the minutes they'd been talking. More federal agents had arrived, men and women in tactical gear and FBI windbreakers who were setting up some kind of command post near the nurses' station. Hospital security stood awkwardly to one side, clearly unsure how to handle the jurisdictional nightmare unfolding in front of them. And in the middle of it all stood Linda Morrison and Ryan Kramer, both looking like they'd just realized they'd walked into something much bigger than a suspended nurse showing up for a shift. Morrison saw Sarah first. Ms. Mitchell, I ordered you off hospital property. The fact that you're here is a direct violation. Ms. Morrison, Flynn's voice cut through hers like a knife. I'm Colonel Marcus Flynn, FBI. As of 20 minutes ago, this hospital is part of an active federal crime scene related to the attack on our convoy. Ms. Mitchell was brought in at my request to assist with casualties, which means she's operating under federal authority. Do you have a problem with that? Morrison's mouth opened and closed. She was used to being the authority in this building, used to people following her orders without question. Having an FBI colonel tell her she didn't have jurisdiction in her own hospital clearly wasn't part of her usual Tuesday night. No, of course not, but she's suspended pending investigation for what exactly? Flynn pulled out a small notebook. I'd like to hear the specific charges. Kramer stepped forward before Morrison could answer. She's been harassing police officers, making false accusations in patient charts, and interfering with lawful arrests. We've had multiple complaints. Multiple complaints from one officer, Sarah said quietly. You. Kramer's face flushed dark red. You don't get to talk right now. You're done. You're finished. By tomorrow morning, you'll be lucky if you can get a job at a gas station, let alone another hospital. Officer Kramer, Flynn's voice was dangerously soft. I'm going to need you to step back and take a breath because right now you're interfering with a federal investigation and threatening a potential witness. And I'm not sure you understand how serious that is. Witness to what? There's no investigation? There is now. Flynn gestured to two of the agents near the nurses' station. Agent Ross, Agent Kim, I need Officer Kramer escorted to a private room where we can have a conversation about Diana Price and the circumstances surrounding her arrest and death in custody. The room went dead silent. Sarah watched the color drain from Kramer's face, Watched the realization hit him that whatever game he'd been playing had just changed rules. Morrison looked between Kramer and Flynn, clearly trying to calculate the political ramifications of what was happening. Diana Price's death was investigated and ruled a suicide, Kramer said, but his voice had lost its edge. This is harassment. I'm a decorated officer with 15 years of service, and I'm a federal agent investigating the death of a federal witness in police custody. So unless you'd like me to add obstruction to the list of things we're going to discuss, I suggest you cooperate. Flynn nodded to the agents. Take him to consultation room 3. Make sure he's comfortable. The two agents moved forward. For a moment, Sarah thought Kramer might actually try to fight. His hand twitched toward his weapon, and every federal agent in the hallway tensed. Then whatever survival instinct he had left kicked in, and he raised his hand slowly. This is wrong, he said, looking directly at Sarah. You're going to regret this. All of you. Room 3, Flynn repeated, and the agents led Kramer away. The hallway erupted in whispered conversations. Nurses who'd been pretending not to watch were now openly staring. Dr. Webb appeared from one of the trauma bays, took one look at the situation, and immediately turned around and disappeared again. Morrison stood frozen, clearly trying to figure out how to regain control of a situation that had spiraled completely beyond her authority. Flynn turned to Sarah. I need those charts. Every patient Kramer brought in over the past year, every notation you made, every piece of documentation that might support a pattern of abuse. Can you get them? Not without system access, and Morrison already locked me out. Ms. Morrison. Flynn didn't raise his voice, but Morrison flinched anyway. I'm going to need full access to your medical records system for the federal investigation. And I'm going to need Miss Mitchell reinstated immediately with full privileges so she can assist in identifying relevant patient encounters. Morrison found her voice. I can't just reinstate someone who's been suspended. There are procedures, union requirements, then unsuspend her. Because right now I've got 4 critically wounded federal agents, a dead witness, and what looks like a systematic pattern of police brutality that your hospital has been documenting and ignoring for months. You can either cooperate and maybe avoid being named as co-defendants in the civil rights lawsuit that's coming, or you can stand here and quote union procedures at me while I get a federal warrant and shut down your entire ER as a crime scene. Your choice. Sarah had never seen Morrison move so fast. She pulled out her phone, made 2 quick calls, and within 5 minutes Sarah's badge was being returned by a very nervous security guard and her system access was restored. Morrison didn't apologize. She didn't even make eye contact. She just handed over the badge and disappeared toward the administrative offices like the building was on fire. Tom appeared at Sarah's elbow as the security guard walked away. What the hell just happened? I think I just got my job back, Sarah said, staring at the badge in her hand. No, I mean, what the hell happened to you? Where did all that come from? He gestured vaguely toward the trauma bays. I've worked with you for 8 months and I've never seen you take charge like that. It was like watching a completely different person. Sarah clipped the badge to her scrubs. That was me doing the job I was trained to do, Tom. The job I haven't been allowed to do since I got here. Before he could respond, one of Flynn's agents approached. Lieutenant Mitchell, the colonel needs you in consultation room 1. We're pulling the medical records now, but he wants you there to walk us through what we're looking at. Sarah followed the agent down the hallway, past the same trauma bays where she'd spent 8 months feeling powerless and invisible. Nurses stared as she walked past. Some looked curious. Some looked angry. Kelly Rodriguez caught her eye and gave her a small nod that might have been approval or might have been goodbye. Sarah couldn't tell. Consultation room 1 had been converted into a makeshift command center. Laptops were set up on the table, papers were spread across every available surface, and 3 agents were already working through what looked like surveillance footage. Flynn stood at the head of the table with Agent David Price beside him. Sarah recognized him immediately. He had his sister's eyes, the same quiet desperation she'd seen in Diana that night. But where Diana had looked defeated, David Price looked furious. Ms. Mitchell, he said when Sarah entered. His voice was rough, like he'd been shouting or crying or both. Thank you for documenting what happened to Diana. Nobody else bothered. I'm sorry I didn't do more. The words felt inadequate. I should have pushed harder, questioned the medical clearance. You did more than anyone else in this building. David gestured at the laptop screens. We've been reviewing the charts you flagged. 15 patients over 8 months, all brought in by Officer Kramer, all with injuries that don't match the arrest reports. Diana was number 16. Flynn pulled up a chair. Lieutenant, we need you to walk us through each case. Start with the most recent and work backward. Tell us everything you remember, what you saw, what you documented, what happened after. So Sarah talked. She started with Diana Price and worked backward through 8 months of carefully documented abuse. The overdose patient from 3 weeks ago with the broken ribs that didn't match his arrest story. The teenager with defensive wounds on her arms and terror in her eyes. The middle-aged man who'd been arrested for public intoxication but had finger-shaped bruises on his throat. Case after case, patient after patient, a pattern so clear Sarah couldn't understand how nobody had seen it before. Except people had seen it. Dr. Webb had seen it and told her to keep quiet. Morrison had seen it and suspended her for making waves. The other nurses had seen it and looked away because it was easier than getting involved. Everyone had seen it, and everyone had made the calculation that their careers were worth more than the truth. This one. David Price stopped her on case number 9, a young man named Marcus Webb, no relation to the doctor, who'd been brought in semi-conscious with a head injury. I know him. He was part of Diana's witness group. She mentioned him in one of her last calls. He looked at Flynn. How many of these patients were connected to the corruption investigation? Flynn was already typing on his laptop, running cross-reference now against the witness list and persons of interest. He paused, staring at the screen. 7. We've got 7 matches between Mitchell's documentation and our investigation. The room went quiet. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. You're saying Kramer knew who these people were. He targeted them specifically. That's exactly what I'm saying. Flynn pulled up another window on his laptop. Diana Price was arrested on false drug charges 2 weeks before she was scheduled to testify. Marcus Webb was arrested for assault 3 days after he gave a deposition. Jennifer Santos arrested for prostitution the same night she agreed to wear a wire. He looked up at Sarah. You documented all of them, and every single one of them was medically cleared and sent back into Kramer's custody despite having injuries that should have raised red flags. Dr. Webb cleared them, Sarah said. I questioned it every time, and he overruled me. He said it wasn't our job to question police reports. Dr. Webb, David Price made a note on his tablet. We need to talk to him too. Flynn nodded. Add him to the list, along with Morrison and anyone else who knew about these cases and didn't report them. He stood and walked to the window overlooking the ER. This is bigger than one corrupt cop. This is systemic failure across multiple institutions, police department, hospital administration, probably the prosecutor's office if they were filing charges based on Kramer's reports. Sarah watched him process the scope of what they were looking at. She'd spent 8 months drowning in the same realization, trying to reconcile the idea that the system she'd trusted to do the right thing was actually designed to protect itself at the expense of the people it was supposed to serve. What happens now? She asked. Now we build a case. Flynn turned back to the room. We pull every chart, every arrest report, every piece of documentation we can find. We interview witnesses. We put together a timeline that shows exactly what Kramer was doing and who was helping him cover it up. He looked at Sarah. And we're going to need you to testify to all of it, not just in a deposition, but in front of a grand jury and eventually in open court. Are you prepared for that? Sarah thought about what would happen when she testified. The defense attorneys who would try to discredit her, the hospital colleagues who would see her as a traitor, the career she'd be destroying by speaking up. Then she thought about Diana Price dying alone in a cell and all the other patients she'd failed because she'd been too afraid to push back hard enough. I'm prepared, she said. Flynn studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. Good, because this is going to get ugly before it gets better. He had no idea how right he was. The next 2 hours were a blur of activity. More agents arrived. More charts were pulled. Sarah walked them through case after case, providing context and medical interpretation for injuries that the arrest reports tried to explain away. Somewhere around midnight, someone ordered pizza that nobody ate. The coffee ran out twice. At 1:30 in the morning, Agent Ross burst into the consultation room with her laptop open. Colonel, you need to see this. We pulled surveillance footage from the jail where Diana Price died. The official report says she hanged herself with a bedsheet at 2 a.m., but watch this. She turned the laptop so everyone could see. The footage showed a cell with a woman lying on a bunk. Diana, Sarah assumed, though the angle made it hard to see her face. The timestamp read 11:47 p.m. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then a figure entered the frame, male, heavy-set, moving with the kind of swagger Sarah recognized immediately. "That's Kramer," David Price said, his voice tight. They watched as Kramer stood over Diana's bunk, watched as he said something they couldn't hear, watched as Diana sat up slowly, her body language screaming fear. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. Then Kramer left and Diana lay back down. The timestamp jumped forward, 2:03 a.m. Guards rushing into the cell, Diana hanging from a bedsheet tied to the light fixture. CPR being performed while someone called for medical assistance. The official story playing out exactly as it had been reported. "Go back to the 11:47 timestamp," Flynn ordered. "Zoom in on Kramer's hands." Ross rewound and zoomed. Sarah leaned forward, squinting at the pixelated image. Kramer's right hand was holding something small, something he showed to Diana during their conversation. It was impossible to tell what it was from the footage. "He threatened her," David said flatly. "He went into her cell in the middle of the night and threatened her, and 6 hours later she was dead." "We can't prove that from this footage alone," Flynn said, but his voice was grim. "Defense will argue he was doing a welfare check, that the conversation was routine. We need more." "I can give you more." The voice came from the doorway. Everyone turned to see Dr. Webb standing there, his face gray and haggard. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past few hours. "I can give you everything." Flynn gestured to a chair. "Sit down, Dr. Webb. Tell us what you know." Webb sat heavily, his hands shaking. "I've been clearing Kramer's arrest for 3 years. Every time he brought in someone who looked beaten up, I signed off on it. Told myself it wasn't my problem, that I was just doing my job." He looked at Sarah for the first time. "You were right to question me. Every time. And I shut you down because I was scared." "Scared of what?" Flynn asked. "Of Kramer. Of losing my medical license. Of what would happen if I testified about what I'd seen." Webb pulled a flash drive from his pocket and set it on the table. "That's copies of every chart I falsified, every medical clearance I signed that I knew was wrong, every conversation I had with Morrison about keeping quiet. I kept records because some part of me knew this day would come." Sarah stared at the flash drive. "You've had evidence this whole time and you said nothing." "I'm saying something now." Webb met her eyes. "It doesn't fix what I did. It doesn't bring Diana Price back or help the others I failed, but maybe it stops it from happening again." Flynn took the flash drive and handed it to Agent Ross. "Get this cataloged as evidence, and get Dr. Webb's full statement on record." Webb stood to follow Ross, then paused. "Sarah, for whatever it's worth, I'm sorry. You were the only one brave enough to do the right thing, and I punished you for it." Sarah didn't respond. She wasn't interested in Webb's apologies or his guilt-driven confession. She was interested in making sure that every piece of evidence got documented, every witness got interviewed, and every person who'd helped Kramer escape accountability for 3 years faced consequences. The night wore on. More evidence accumulated. More witnesses came forward. Nurses who'd seen things and stayed quiet, other police officers who'd suspected Kramer but never reported him, even a prosecutor who admitted she'd had doubts about cases Kramer brought her but filed charges anyway because the arrest reports were technically complete. By dawn, Flynn had enough to arrest Kramer on federal charges. By 9 a.m., local police were executing search warrants on his home and locker. By noon, 3 other officers connected to the corruption investigation had been suspended pending review. Sarah watched it all unfold from the consultation room, still wearing her scrubs from a shift that should have ended 18 hours ago. She was exhausted, running on coffee and adrenaline, but every time she thought about leaving, another piece of evidence would surface and she'd force herself to stay focused. At 2 p.m., Tom Bradley knocked on the door. "Sarah, you need to take a break. You've been here for 20 hours straight." "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're swaying on your feet." He pulled out a chair. "Sit down before you fall down." Sarah sat because her legs were shaking and she didn't trust herself to keep standing. Tom handed her a bottle of water and a sandwich from the cafeteria that she couldn't remember ordering. "Morrison's gone," Tom said quietly. "Resigned about an hour ago." Board of Directors is calling it a mutual separation, but everyone knows she was fired. Good. The board also announced they're launching a full internal review of ER protocols related to police custody cases. They want you to consult on it. Tom paused. They're scared, Sarah. Scared of lawsuits, scared of federal oversight, scared that everything that happened here is going to end up on the national news. It should be on the national news. People should know what was happening. I agree. But that doesn't mean it's going to be easy for you when it does. Tom leaned back in his chair. The other nurses are already talking. Half of them think you're a hero. The other half think you're a traitor who threw everyone under the bus to save yourself. I didn't do this to save myself. I know that, but they don't. And when this goes to trial, when you're testifying in open court about everything you saw, they're going to feel like you're testifying against them too. Against the doctors who told you to keep quiet. Against the administration that tried to bury it. Against everyone who was just trying to survive in a broken system. Sarah took a drink of water, buying herself time to process what Tom was telling her. She'd known there would be consequences to speaking up. She just hadn't let herself think too hard about what those consequences might look like. Are you saying I should have kept quiet? She asked finally. No, I'm saying you did the right thing and it's going to cost you, and you should be prepared for that. Tom stood. I've got to get back to the floor. But Sarah, whatever happens next, you don't face it alone. Some of us see what you did. Some of us are grateful someone finally had the guts to say what needed to be said. He left before Sarah could respond. She sat in the empty consultation room, staring at the evidence spread across the table and wondering if Tom was right. Wondering what it would feel like when the other nurses started treating her like an outsider, when the doctors stopped making eye contact in the hallways, when everyone at Riverside General began to see her as the person who'd exposed their collective failure. The door opened again, and Flynn appeared. We're bringing Kramer in for formal questioning in 20 minutes. I'd like you there when we do. Sarah stood, her exhaustion forgotten. Why? Because I think seeing you across the table from him, knowing you're the reason everything is falling apart, will rattle him enough to make mistakes. Flynn held the door open. You up for it? Sarah thought about Diana Price's hopeless eyes, about Marcus Webb's fear, about all the patients she'd documented and failed. She thought about the 8 months she'd spent feeling powerless while Kramer terrorized people with impunity. I'm up for it, she said. The interrogation room was small and windowless, with a metal table bolted to the floor and cameras recording from 3 angles. Kramer sat on one side in handcuffs, his lawyer, a nervous-looking woman in an expensive suit beside him. Flynn sat across from them with Agent Ross taking notes. Sarah stood against the back wall where Kramer could see her every time he looked up. Flynn went through the preliminary questions: name, badge number, years of service. Kramer answered mechanically, his eyes flicking towards Sarah every few seconds. The lawyer kept trying to shut down questions, citing client privilege and lack of probable cause, but Flynn had enough evidence to power through her objections. Let's talk about Diana Price, Flynn said, sliding a photo across the table. Do you remember arresting her on April 3rd? Kramer glanced at the photo. I arrest a lot of people. I can't remember everyone. Try. Federal witness. Drug charges. You brought her to Riverside General for medical clearance around midnight. If you say so, like I said, I arrest a lot of people. Flynn slid another photo across the table. This one showed Diana in the hospital bay, the bruising on her throat clearly visible. Does this help your memory? Kramer's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. That's strangulation marks, Flynn said conversationally. According to the medical documentation by Nurse Sarah Mitchell, they were consistent with manual compression of the airway by someone with large hands. Someone like you, Officer Kramer. My client doesn't have to answer that, the lawyer interjected. He doesn't have to, but I'm going to keep asking anyway. Flynn pulled out more photos, spreading them across the table like cards in a poker game. Marcus Webb, Jennifer Santos, David Morrison, 15 different people over 8 months, all arrested by you, all with injuries that don't match your reports, all medically documented by the same nurse. Want to know what else they have in common? Kramer said nothing. They were all connected to a federal corruption investigation. They were all potential witnesses or persons of interest. And now 7 of them are dead or missing. Flynn leaned forward. That's one hell of a coincidence, don't you think? The lawyer was sweating now. This is harassment. My client has rights. Your client has the right to remain silent, which he's exercising. But I have the right to present evidence of a pattern of behavior that suggests he was systematically targeting and assaulting federal witnesses. Flynn pulled out the flash drive Webb had provided, including testimony from the physician who falsified medical clearances under pressure from your client. Kramer's head snapped up. Webb's lying. He cleared those patients because they were fine. So you do remember them? Flynn smiled. Funny how your memory suddenly improved. The lawyer put her hand on Kramer's arm, but he shook her off, his composure cracking. This is setup. You got that nurse to make up a bunch of lies about me because you need someone to blame for your investigation falling apart. The investigation didn't fall apart. We've got 7 witnesses willing to testify, video surveillance of you visiting Diana Price hours before she died, and medical documentation from a decorated combat nurse who has exactly 0 reason to lie. Flynn gestured to Sarah. You want to tell me why Lieutenant Mitchell would risk her career to make up stories about you? Kramer turned to look at Sarah directly for the first time. The hatred in his eyes was pure and undiluted. Because she thinks she's better than everyone else, thinks she's some kind of hero, but she's just another nobody who couldn't cut it in the real world, so she came here to play nurse and judge people who actually do the hard work. The hard work of beating suspects? Sarah's voice cut through his rant. Everyone in the room turned to stare at her. She'd meant to stay quiet, meant to let Flynn handle the interrogation, but hearing Kramer talk about her like she was the problem finally broke something loose. The hard work of threatening witnesses? Or the hard work of making sure Diana Price never made it to trial? You don't know anything. I know you went to her cell at 11:47 p.m. the night she died. I know you threatened her, and I know that 6 hours later she was found hanging from a bedsheet, even though the psychiatric evaluation 3 hours earlier said she wasn't suicidal. Sarah pushed off the wall and walked closer to the table. What did you say to her, Officer Kramer? What did you tell her that made her so scared she'd rather die than face another day in your custody? Kramer surged to his feet and his lawyer grabbed his arm, pulling him back down. Don't say another word, she hissed. But the damage was done. Flynn had seen the reaction, had seen the guilt and rage flash across Kramer's face in the half-second before he controlled it. The cameras had caught it all. I think we're done here, Flynn said, gathering the photos. Officer Kramer, you're being charged with federal civil rights violations, obstruction of justice, assault under color of authority, and conspiracy to commit murder. Your lawyer can explain what that means. The interrogation ended, but Sarah stood there for a moment longer, watching as federal agents led Kramer out of the room in handcuffs. He looked back at her once, his expression promising that this wasn't over, that even from a cell he'd find a way to make her pay. Sarah didn't look away. She'd spent 8 months being afraid of him, 8 months letting him control the narrative. She was done being afraid. Outside the interrogation room, Flynn pulled her aside. That was risky. I know. But effective. His lawyer's going to have a hard time walking back that reaction. Flynn paused. You should go home, Lieutenant. Get some sleep. This is just beginning, and you're going to need your strength for what comes next. Sarah nodded, but she didn't move. She stood in the hallway of Riverside General, the hospital where she'd spent 8 months feeling invisible and powerless, and tried to process everything that had happened in the past 24 hours. The mass casualty event, Flynn's appearance, Kramer's arrest, Webb's confession, Morrison's resignation. Her phone buzzed with a text from Kelly Rodriguez. Channel 7 is outside with cameras. Whole story is breaking. You okay? Sarah looked toward the ER entrance where she could see news vans setting up in the parking lot, reporters with microphones already broadcasting live. The story was out. By tonight it would be national news. By tomorrow her name would be everywhere, attached to the words whistleblower and hero, and probably troublemaker depending on who was telling the story. She texted back, I'm okay. Thanks for asking. Then she turned and walked toward the hospital exit, still wearing her scrubs, her badge clipped to her chest. The automatic doors slid open and she stepped outside into afternoon sunshine that felt too bright after 24 hours inside. The reporter saw her immediately. Microphones turned in her direction. Cameras swiveled to capture her walking through the parking lot. Someone shouted her name. Ms. Mitchell, is it true you documented evidence of police brutality? Ms. Mitchell, how long has this been going on? Ms. Mitchell, are you the whistleblower who brought down Officer Kramer? Sarah kept walking, her keys in her hand, her eyes fixed on her car. She didn't owe them answers. She didn't owe them her story. She'd given her statement to the FBI, and that was enough. She was 10 feet from her car when someone stepped directly into her path. It was a woman in her 30s, dressed in jeans and a leather jacket, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She wasn't holding a microphone or a camera. She was just standing there, blocking Sarah's way. Sarah Mitchell, the woman asked, I'm not making a statement. I don't want a statement. I want to thank you. The woman pulled a photograph from her jacket and held it out. This is my brother. His name was Marcus Webb. Officer Kramer arrested him 6 months ago for assault. Your documentation of his injuries is the only proof we have that Kramer beat him unconscious before booking him. Her voice cracked. Marcus died 3 months ago. The official cause was complications from drug use, but I know it was from the head trauma Kramer gave him. I know it, and I can't prove it, and it's been eating me alive. Sarah took the photograph with shaking hands. Marcus Webb stared back at her from the image, young and smiling and very much alive. She remembered his case, remembered documenting the skull fracture that didn't match the arrest report, remembered Dr. Webb clearing him for booking anyway. I'm sorry, Sarah said. I should have done more. You did enough. The woman took the photo back gently. You documented the truth when everyone else was looking away. That matters. That's going to help put Kramer away, and it's going to help me get justice for Marcus. She paused. I just wanted you to know that what you did wasn't for nothing. She walked away before Sarah could respond, disappearing into the crowd of reporters and onlookers that had gathered outside the hospital. Sarah stood there in the parking lot, her hands still shaking, and felt something inside her chest crack open. For 8 months, she'd been documenting injuries and filing reports and telling herself it didn't matter because nothing ever changed. But it had mattered. It had mattered to Diana Price's brother. It had mattered to Marcus Webb's sister. It had mattered to every person who'd been hurt by Kramer and told that their injuries didn't count because a police report said otherwise. Sarah got in her car and drove home through city streets that looked different somehow, like she was seeing them for the first time. She parked in her usual spot, climbed the stairs to her apartment, and stood in the doorway looking at the space she'd been hiding in for 8 months. Then she sat down on her couch and finally let herself cry. She cried for Diana Price and Marcus Webb and all the others. She cried for the nurse she'd been in Kandahar who'd known how to save people and hadn't second-guessed herself. She cried for the 8 months she'd spent trying to be small and quiet and invisible because it was safer than fighting back. When the tears finally stopped, Sarah pulled out her laptop and opened her email. There were already hundreds of messages, reporters requesting interviews, lawyers offering representation, advocacy groups asking her to speak at events. She scrolled past all of them and opened a new message to Colonel Flynn. What do you need from me next? His response came back within minutes. Grand jury convenes Monday. We'll need your testimony. After that, trial prep. Could take months. Sarah typed, I'll be there. She sent the email and closed her laptop. Then she stood, walked to her bedroom, and pulled a box from the back of her closet. Inside was her army uniform, carefully folded and preserved, along with her medical corps insignia and the commendation medal she'd received for her service in Kandahar. She hadn't looked at these in 3 years, hadn't wanted to remember who she'd been before Riverside General had tried to convince her she was nobody. Sarah held the medal in her hand and thought about Colonel Flynn's salute in the ER, thought about Agent David Price thanking her for documenting his sister's injuries, thought about Marcus Webb's sister standing in a parking lot with a photograph and a broken heart. Someone knocked on her apartment door. Sarah set the medal down and walked to the door, expecting maybe a reporter who'd tracked down her address or a neighbor with questions about the news vans outside. Instead, she found Flynn standing in the hallway in civilian clothes, looking tired but alert. Colonel? We need to talk, he said. Can I come in? Sarah stepped aside and let him enter. Flynn walked into her small living room and immediately spotted the army uniform spread across the couch. He picked up the medal, examined it, then set it back down carefully. 3 bronze stars and a purple heart, he said. I pulled your service record after I saw you in the trauma bay. You left out some details when you were telling me about Kandahar. It wasn't relevant. It's relevant now. Flynn turned to face her. Kramer made bail 2 hours ago. His department pooled money for a bondsman, and a judge who doesn't like federal overreach signed off on release pending trial. Sarah felt the floor tilt under her feet. He's out? He's out, with conditions. Ankle monitor, no contact with witnesses, surrendered passport. But he's out. Flynn's expression was grim. His lawyer is already building a defense that you fabricated evidence because you have PTSD from your military service and you see enemies everywhere. They're going to try to discredit you by saying you're unstable, that your combat experience made you paranoid, that you can't be trusted to give accurate testimony. That's ridiculous. That's their strategy, and it might work if we can't prove you're completely credible. Flynn pulled an envelope from his jacket, which is why the prosecution wants you to undergo an independent psychological evaluation, to prove you're competent to testify and that your documentation was based on clinical observation, not paranoid delusions. Sarah took the envelope but didn't open it. And if I refuse, then the defense gets to paint whatever picture they want, and the jury never hears the truth about what Kramer did. Flynn paused. I know it's not fair. I know you're the victim here, and you shouldn't have to prove you're sane just because you had the guts to document what you saw. But this is the system we're working with. Sarah opened the envelope. Inside was information about a forensic psychologist who specialized in PTSD evaluations for law enforcement and military personnel. The appointment was scheduled for Thursday morning. What if the evaluation says I'm not competent? Sarah asked quietly. Then we lose. Kramer walks, and everyone he hurt never gets justice. Flynn met her eyes. But I don't think that's going to happen. I think you're going to walk in there and prove exactly what I already know, that you're the most competent person in this whole situation and the only one who had the integrity to do what was right. He left after that, leaving Sarah alone with her uniform and her medals and the envelope containing an appointment that would determine whether 8 months of documentation and one very long night of testimony would amount to anything at all. Sarah sat down on her couch and stared at the evaluation paperwork. Then she looked at her bronze stars and thought about all the times she'd been tested under fire, all the times she'd had to make impossible decisions with incomplete information and lives hanging in the balance. This was just another test, just another battlefield, and she'd survived worse. Sarah picked up her phone and called the psychologist's office to confirm the appointment. Then she called Flynn back. I'll do the evaluation, she said, but I want something in return. Name it. I want access to every piece of evidence you're using to build the case against Kramer. Every witness statement, every arrest report, every video. Because if I'm going to testify, I want to know exactly what I'm walking into. Flynn was quiet for a moment. That's a lot of material. I've got time. All right, I'll have Agent Ross send you secure access to the case files tomorrow. He paused. Lieutenant, you know this is going to get worse before it gets better, right? Kramer's not going down without a fight, and he's got friends who are going to do everything they can to protect him. I know. And you're still willing to see it through? Sarah looked at her medals again, thought about the soldiers she'd saved and the ones she couldn't. Thought about Diana Price and Marcus Webb and all the others who'd never gotten the chance to fight back. I'm still willing, she said. She hung up and sat in her quiet apartment as evening turned to night outside her windows. Tomorrow, the psychological evaluation. Next week, the grand jury. After that, months of preparation leading to a trial that would decide whether one corrupt cop faced consequences, or whether the system that protected him would find another way to sweep everything under the rug. Sarah knew the odds weren't good. She knew that even with all the evidence they'd collected, conviction rates for police officers were dismally low. She knew that defending whistleblowers was something people liked in theory, but rarely supported in practice once it got messy and expensive and politically complicated. But she also knew that Diana Price had died alone in a cell, thinking nobody cared about her. That Marcus Webb's sister was still carrying around his photograph like a talisman against grief. That somewhere out there were more victims of Kramer's violence, who'd never told their stories because they didn't think anyone would listen. Sarah stood and walked to her window, looking out at the city lights of Riverside spread below her. Somewhere in that sprawl of buildings and streets, Kramer was probably sitting in his home with his ankle monitor, plotting his defense, and making lists of everyone who'd betrayed him, making plans for revenge. Let him plan. Let him plot. Sarah had spent 3 years in a war zone learning how to operate under constant threat. She wasn't afraid of one corrupt cop with a vendetta. Her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Sarah almost deleted it, assuming it was another reporter, but something made her open it. "You made a mistake testifying against Officer Kramer. People who make that kind of mistake tend to have unfortunate accidents. Consider this your only warning." Sarah stared at the message for a long moment. Then she took a screenshot, forwarded it to Flynn with a note about reporting it to the FBI, and blocked the number. The threat was meant to scare her into backing down, into disappearing before she could damage Kramer's defense. It had the opposite effect. Sarah felt something cold and focused settle into her chest, the same clarity she'd felt in Kandahar when the mortars started falling, and there was no time for fear, only action. Kramer and whoever was helping him had just confirmed what she'd already known. This was going to be a war, and she needed to be ready for it. She pulled out her laptop and opened the secure file system Flynn had mentioned. Her access credentials were already active. Sarah spent the next 4 hours reading through case files, watching surveillance footage, studying arrest reports, and medical documentation. She made notes. She cross-referenced timelines. She built her own understanding of the case that would be presented at trial. By midnight, she had a headache and burning eyes and a stomach full of rage at the scope of what Kramer had been doing for years while people looked the other way. But she also had something else, a complete picture of exactly how many lives her documentation might help save. 17 witnesses willing to testify, 23 documented cases of abuse, 7 deaths that might be connected to Kramer's pattern of violence. It was bigger than Diana Price, bigger than Marcus Webb. This was institutional corruption that had infected an entire department, an entire hospital, probably an entire city. And Sarah Mitchell, the nobody nurse who didn't matter, was the one person who'd documented it all. She closed her laptop around 2 a.m. and finally let herself sleep. But her dreams were full of faces, patients she'd treated, soldiers she'd saved, people she'd failed. When her alarm went off at 7, she woke feeling like she hadn't slept at all. The psychological evaluation was scheduled for 10 a.m. Sarah got up, showered, dressed in civilian clothes that made her feel exposed without her scrubs, and drove to the psychologist's office in a building downtown. The waiting room was empty except for a receptionist who barely looked up when Sarah checked in. Doctor. Patricia Reeves appeared exactly on time, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and the kind of professional warmth that came from decades of listening to other people's trauma. She led Sarah into an office lined with books and gestured to a comfortable chair. "I've reviewed your military service record and the basic facts of the case," Dr. Reeves said, settling into her own chair with a notepad. "What I need to understand today is your state of mind when you were documenting these patient injuries and your state of mind now. The goal is to determine whether you're competent to testify and whether your clinical observations were influenced by any psychological conditions that might affect their reliability. Does that make sense?" "It makes sense." "Good. Let's start with your military service. You were deployed to Kandahar for 3 years as a combat medic. Can you tell me about that experience?" Sarah talked. She talked about the field hospital and the casualties that never stopped coming. She talked about learning to triage under fire and performing procedures she'd never been trained for because there was nobody else to do them. She talked about the soldiers she'd saved by improvising a chest tube from a ballpoint pen and the one she'd lost because the medevac helicopter couldn't land in the mortar fire. Dr. Reeves listened without judgment, making occasional notes, asking clarifying questions. When Sarah finished, the psychologist was quiet for a moment. "That's significant trauma," she said finally. "Have you received treatment for PTSD related to your combat service?" "I did 6 months of therapy after I mustered out. It helped." "But you still have symptoms." Sarah hesitated. "Sometimes. Mostly just hypervigilance. Trouble sleeping. I startle easily at loud noises." "All normal responses to what you experienced." Dr. Reeves made another note. "Now let's talk about your work at Riverside General. When you documented injuries on patients brought in by Officer Kramer, were you experiencing any PTSD symptoms at the time?" "No, I was doing my job as a nurse. Clinical observation and documentation based on objective medical findings. But you must have noticed patterns. You must have formed opinions about what was happening to these patients." "I noticed that injuries didn't match arrest reports. I documented what I saw and what patients told me. The patterns emerged from the documentation. not from my assumptions. Dr. Reeves leaned forward slightly. Sarah, I need to ask you something directly. When you look at Officer Kramer, do you see him as he is, a police officer accused of abuse, or do you see him as a threat similar to threats you faced in combat? It was the question Sarah had been waiting for. The question that would determine whether her testimony would be considered credible or dismissed as the paranoid delusions of a traumatized veteran. I see him exactly as he is, Sarah said carefully. A man who used his authority to hurt vulnerable people and who was protected by a system that valued his position more than their lives. I don't need combat experience to recognize abuse, Dr. Reeves. I just needed to be willing to document it when everyone else was looking away. The evaluation continued for another 90 minutes. More questions about her state of mind, her decision-making process, her motivations for testifying. Dr. Reeves was thorough but not hostile, professional but not cold. When they finally finished, Sarah felt wrung out and exhausted. I'll have my report completed by tomorrow, Dr. Reeves said as she walked Sarah to the door. The prosecution will receive it first, then the defense. If there are any concerns, we may need to schedule a follow-up evaluation. And if there aren't concerns? Dr. Reeves smiled slightly. Then you'll testify at the grand jury hearing on Monday, and we'll all see what happens next. Sarah left the office and walked out into downtown Riverside's midday chaos. She was halfway to her car when her phone rang. Flynn's number. The evaluation went fine, Sarah said without preamble. I won't know results until tomorrow, but I think it went fine. Good. Because we have a problem. Flynn's voice was tight. Jennifer Santos, one of the witnesses who was going to testify about Kramer assaulting her during arrest. She's missing. Didn't show up for work this morning, not answering her phone. Her apartment looks like she left in a hurry. Sarah stopped walking. Around her, office workers hurried past on their lunch breaks, oblivious to the conversation she was having. You think Kramer got to her? I think someone got to her. Whether it was Kramer directly or someone working on his behalf, I don't know. But she's gone, and we can't compel testimony from someone we can't find. Flynn paused. Sarah, you need to be careful. I'm going to assign a protection detail. No. Sarah, I said no. If Kramer or his people see federal agents following me around, they'll know they got to me. They'll know I'm scared, and I'm not giving them that satisfaction. This isn't about satisfaction, it's about keeping you alive long enough to testify. Then give me a panic button, or a direct line, or whatever you think I need. But I'm not walking around with bodyguards making me look like I need protection. Sarah resumed walking toward her car. I spent 3 years in a combat zone, Colonel. I know how to watch my back. Flynn sighed. You're as stubborn as you were in Kandahar. You said that like it's a bad thing. It wasn't then. I'm not sure about now. He was quiet for a moment. All right, no protection detail. But you carry this phone with you at all times. I'm having a secure device couriered to your apartment this afternoon. It has a direct line to the FBI field office and a GPS tracker. If anything happens, anything at all, you press the red button and we'll have agents at your location within minutes. I can live with that. And Sarah, don't go anywhere alone after dark. Don't meet with anyone connected to this case without telling me first. And if you see anything suspicious, and I mean anything, you call immediately. Understood? Understood. Sarah hung up and got in her car, her hand shaking slightly as she started the engine. Jennifer Santos was missing. One of their witnesses had disappeared less than a week before the grand jury hearing. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't an accident. Someone was cleaning house. Someone was making sure that when the trial started, there wouldn't be enough witnesses left to convict Kramer. And Sarah had just painted a target on her own back by refusing protective custody. She drove home slowly, checking her mirrors more often than necessary, taking random turns to make sure nobody was following her. The FBI phone arrived at 3 p.m., delivered by a courier who made her sign 3 different forms and verify her identity twice. Sarah activated it immediately and clipped it to her belt next to her regular phone. Then she sat in her apartment and waited for something to happen. Nothing did. The afternoon passed quietly. Evening came and went. By 10 p.m., Sarah was starting to think maybe she'd overreacted. Maybe Jennifer Santos had just gotten scared and run. Maybe the threatening text had been an empty gesture. At 10:15, someone knocked on her door. Sarah froze. She wasn't expecting anyone. Flynn would have called first. Kelly Rodriguez would have texted. Tom Bradley didn't even know where she lived. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Sarah walked quietly to the door and looked through the peephole. A woman stood in the hallway, mid-20s, wearing a hoodie and jeans, her hands shoved deep in her pockets. She looked nervous, glancing over her shoulder every few seconds like she expected someone to appear behind her. "Miss Mitchell?" the woman called through the door. "My name is Jennifer Santos. I need your help." Sarah's hand went to the FBI phone on her belt, her finger hovering over the red button. Through the peephole, Jennifer Santos shifted her weight from foot to foot, her eyes darting toward the stairwell at the end of the hallway. She looked terrified. "How do I know you're really Jennifer Santos?" Sarah called through the door. "You documented my injuries 3 months ago. Kramer arrested me outside the courthouse after I gave a deposition. You wrote that the bruising on my ribs was consistent with blunt force trauma from a baton, not from resisting arrest like his report said." Jennifer's voice cracked. "You were the only person who believed me." Sarah remembered the case. Young woman, early 20s, brought in at 2 a.m. with defensive wounds and bruised ribs. Dr. Webb had cleared her in 10 minutes despite Sarah's objections. The next day, Jennifer had recanted her testimony and the charges against her were mysteriously dropped. Sarah opened the door but kept the chain lock engaged. "Flynn said you were missing." "I am missing. I ran because someone broke into my apartment last night and left a photo of my little sister on my pillow with a note that said they knew where she went to school." Jennifer pulled back her hood and Sarah could see fresh bruising along her jawline. "I called my sister, told her to stay with friends, then I disappeared. I've been hiding all day trying to figure out what to do." "Why come to me?" "Because you're the only person who documented what Kramer did. The only one who might actually care if something happens to me or my sister." Jennifer glanced behind her again. "Can I please come inside? I think someone followed me from the bus stop." Sarah's instinct screamed trap, but she'd seen too many scared witnesses, too many people who'd been abandoned by a system that was supposed to protect them. She closed the door, unlatched the chain, and opened it fully. Jennifer stepped inside quickly, and Sarah locked the door behind her, checking the peephole to see if anyone else was in the hallway. It was empty. Sarah turned to find Jennifer standing in the middle of her small living room, her arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold herself together. "I need to call the FBI," Sarah said, pulling out the secure phone. "No!" Jennifer grabbed Sarah's wrist. "You call them, and Kramer will know I'm here. He's got people inside the department feeding him information. How else would he know where my sister goes to school?" Sarah pulled her wrist free gently. "So what's your plan? Hide in my apartment until the trial?" "I don't have a plan, I just—" Jennifer's voice broke completely. "My sister is 9 years old. She has nothing to do with this, and they're threatening her because I was stupid enough to think the system would protect me if I told the truth." Sarah looked at Jennifer's bruised face and saw Diana Price's hopeless eyes, saw Marcus Webb's sister clutching a photograph, saw every patient she'd failed because she'd trusted institutions that valued order over justice. "Sit down," Sarah said. "Tell me everything that happened." Jennifer sat and the story came out in fragments. The break-in at midnight. The photograph on her pillow showing her sister leaving school, taken from across the street with a telephoto lens. The note in block letters. "People who cooperate with federal investigations lose what they love most." "Does anyone else know you're here?" Sarah asked. "No. I took 3 different buses and walked the last mile. I made sure nobody was following me." "You said you thought someone followed you from the bus stop." Jennifer flinched. "I saw a car circle the block twice while I was walking up. Dark sedan, tinted windows. It could have been nothing. Or it could have been everything." Sarah pulled out her regular phone and texted Flynn. "Need to talk. Not urgent, but important. Can you call me in 30 minutes? His response came immediately. "Everything okay?" Sarah typed, "Yes, just need advice on something. 30 minutes. She turned back to Jennifer. "I'm going to help you, but first I need to know. Are you still willing to testify?" Jennifer looked up with red-rimmed eyes. "Will it matter? Or will Kramer just walk anyway, and my sister and I will spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders?" "I don't know," Sarah said honestly. But I know what happens if you don't testify. Kramer keeps hurting people. Other witnesses decide it's not worth the risk. Everything we've documented becomes meaningless. Jennifer was quiet for a long moment. What do we do? Sarah picked up the FBI phone and pressed Flynn's direct number. He answered on the first ring. Mitchell, what's wrong? Jennifer Santos is in my apartment. She showed up 20 minutes ago. Someone threatened her sister, and she ran. Flynn swore quietly. Is she hurt? Bruised but mobile. She says someone broke into her apartment last night and left evidence they've been watching her family. I'm sending a team now. Don't open the door for anyone until they arrive. Stay on the line with me. 5 minutes later, agents Kim and Ross arrived. Ross carried a go-bag that probably contained everything Jennifer would need for protective custody. Miss Santos, Agent Kim said, showing credentials. We're taking you somewhere safe. We'll have your sister picked up within the hour. Jennifer looked at Sarah. You're not coming? I'll be fine. You focus on keeping yourself and your sister safe. Jennifer hesitated, then hugged Sarah quickly. Thank you for believing me when nobody else did. Then she was gone, hustled out by federal agents who moved with efficient urgency. Sarah locked the door and stood in her suddenly empty apartment, heart pounding. Flynn's voice came through the phone. You did the right thing. Did I? Or did I just paint an even bigger target on my back? Both, probably. Flynn paused. The team that just picked up Jennifer, they're good. They'll keep her safe. Sarah hung up and sat on her couch, hands shaking with delayed reaction. If Kramer's people had been watching, they now knew exactly where she lived and that she was actively helping witnesses. At 7 a.m. the next morning, her phone buzzed with a message from Flynn. Psych eval report came in early. Dr. Reeves cleared you for testimony. No signs of PTSD affecting clinical judgment. Defense will receive the report this afternoon. Relief flooded through her. She'd passed. Another message. Grand jury hearing moved up to Friday instead of Monday. Prosecution wants to move fast before any more witnesses disappear. You'll testify first thing Friday morning. Friday, 3 days away. Her regular phone rang. Unknown number. Sarah Mitchell? A woman's voice, professional and clipped. Who is this? Rebecca Holt, Riverside Chronicle. I'm working on a story about the allegations against Officer Kramer, and I'd like your perspective. No comment. The public has a right to know what happened. You're being portrayed as either a hero who exposed corruption or a troubled veteran with an agenda. Don't you want to tell your side? My side will come out in court. The defense is already leaking their version. They're saying you fabricated evidence, that you have PTSD, that you can't be trusted. If you don't respond, that becomes the narrative. I don't control the narrative. I control the truth. And the truth is documented in medical charts that will be presented at trial. Is it true that Jennifer Santos came to your apartment last night? That federal agents removed her through the service entrance? Sarah's blood went cold. Nobody should have known. How did you? I have sources. Sources that suggest you're more involved than the FBI wants to admit. That you're actively recruiting witnesses to testify against Officer Kramer. I'm documenting what I observe and testifying about what I documented. That's it. Then why did a federal witness come to your apartment instead of going directly to the FBI? Sarah hung up. The secure phone buzzed immediately. Flynn. A reporter just called me, Sarah said. Rebecca Holt. She knew about Jennifer. She knew about the sister being pulled from school. How? We're investigating the leak now. The story will run tonight, and by tomorrow morning, you'll be the controversial figure at the center of a high-profile case instead of a witness providing documentation. Can we stop it? We can try, but Rebecca Holt knows exactly where the legal lines are. Flynn paused. The prosecutor wants to meet with you tomorrow to prep for grand jury testimony. 2 p.m., Federal Courthouse downtown, Conference Room 6. Sarah spent the rest of the day in coffee shops across the city, reviewing documentation and rehearsing answers to questions she knew would come, creating patterns of movement that would make her harder to track. At 9 p.m., she finally drove back to her apartment. The parking lot was quiet, the building dark except for scattered windows. Sarah parked in her usual spot and sat for a moment, scanning the area. Nothing, just a normal Tuesday night. She got out, locked the car, and walked toward the building entrance. She was 10 feet from the door when she heard footsteps behind her. Sarah spun, her hand going to the FBI phone. Ryan Kramer stood in the parking lot, his ankle monitor visible above his boot, his hands raised in a gesture that was probably meant to be non-threatening, but only made him look more dangerous. "Easy," he said. "I just want to talk." Sarah's thumb was already pressing the red button on the FBI phone when Kramer spoke again. "You press that. An agent show up, I violated my release conditions, and my lawyer gets everything I say tonight thrown out as coerced." His hands were still raised, but his voice was steady, almost conversational. "But if we talk now, just the two of us, maybe we can figure out how to make this whole thing go away before it ruins both our lives." "We have nothing to talk about." Sarah kept her distance, the phone still in her hand. She could see the ankle monitor blinking under the parking lot lights, could see Kramer's jaw working like he was chewing on words he didn't want to say. "You don't know what you're in the middle of," Kramer said. "You think this is about me? About some bad arrests? This goes way higher than one cop." "Then tell the FBI. Turn witness. Make a deal." "There is no deal for me. Not anymore." Kramer's hands lowered slightly. "But you could still walk away from this. Tell Flynn you made mistakes in your documentation. Tell him the PTSD from your service affected your judgment. They'd understand. Hell, they'd probably give you disability and a pension." Sarah felt cold rage settle in her chest. "You came here to offer me a bribe." "I came here to offer you a way out. There's a difference." "No, there isn't." Sarah took a step back toward the building entrance. "You have 10 seconds to leave before I call Flynn and tell him you violated your release by approaching a witness." Kramer's expression hardened. "You really think you're going to win this? You really think a jury is going to believe a suspended nurse with PTSD over 15 years of decorated service? I think they'll believe the documentation, the medical charts, the surveillance footage, Webb's confession, Jennifer's testimony." Sarah's voice was steady, even though her heart was hammering. "I think they'll believe the truth." "The truth." Kramer laughed, bitter and sharp. "The truth is that people like you always think you're the hero. You think documenting injuries and filing reports makes you special. But you're just another person who doesn't understand how the real world works. The real world where cops beat suspects and threaten witnesses? That world? The world where order matters more than feelings. Where sometimes you have to get rough with people who only understand rough. Where bleeding hearts like you make it harder for the rest of us to do our jobs." But Kramer took a step forward and Sarah's finger tightened on the phone. "Diana Price was a junkie and a liar. Marcus Webb was a dealer. Jennifer Santos was a human being." Sarah cut him off. "They were all human beings who deserve medical care and due process, not beatings in custody. They got what they deserved. No, they got you, and now you're going to get what you deserve." Kramer's face twisted with rage. For a moment, Sarah thought he might actually attack her right there in the parking lot. Ankle monitor and witnesses and consequences be damned. Then headlights swept across the lot, and a car pulled in. Tom Bradley's old sedan, recognizable from the hospital parking garage. Tom got out and took in the scene immediately. "Sarah, you okay?" "I'm fine. Officer Kramer was just leaving." Kramer stared at her for another long moment, then turned and walked toward a dark sedan parked at the far end of the lot. Sarah watched until his taillights disappeared, then let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Tom walked over. "Want to tell me what that was about?" "He tried to get me to recant my testimony, offered me a way out if I claimed PTSD made me unreliable." Tom whistled low. "That's witness tampering. You report it?" "I will. First, I'm going inside and locking every door in my apartment." Sarah managed a weak smile. "What are you doing here?" "Kelly asked me to check on you. She saw the Chronicle article that went live an hour ago and figured you might need backup." Tom pulled out his phone and showed her the headline. "Controversial Nurse at Center of Kramer Case. Hero or Vigilante?" Sarah scanned the article quickly. Rebecca Holt had written exactly what she'd threatened. A piece that painted Sarah as either a crusading whistleblower or a troubled veteran with an agenda, depending on which unnamed source was talking. There were quotes from hospital staff, saying Sarah had always been difficult, quotes from law enforcement sources questioning her mental stability, and buried in the middle, a single paragraph about Diana Price's death that treated it as an unfortunate suicide rather than potential murder. "It's a hit piece," Sarah said quietly. "It's ammunition for the defense," Tom corrected. "But Kelly and I talked to some of the other nurses, the ones who actually worked with you, who saw what was happening. We're drafting a statement supporting your documentation and your character. We're not letting them control the narrative." Sarah looked up at him, surprised. "You don't have to do that. It could cost you—" "We know, we're doing it anyway." Tom's expression was firm. "Morrison's gone. Webb confessed. The time for keeping our heads down and hoping everything blows over is over. Some of us should have spoken up months ago." Sarah felt something tight in her chest loosen slightly. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. Thank me after Kramer's convicted." Tom walked her to the building entrance. "Get inside. Lock up, and call Flynn about the parking lot conversation." Sarah did exactly that. She locked herself in her apartment, called Flynn, and reported Kramer's approach, then spent the next hour fielding calls from Agent Ross about witness tampering charges and violation of release conditions. By midnight, Kramer was back in custody and his bail was revoked. By 1 a.m., Sarah was lying in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind too wired to sleep. Friday morning arrived with gray skies and the kind of cold rain that made Riverside feel more miserable than usual. Sarah dressed in a dark suit she'd bought specifically for the grand jury testimony, pulled her hair back in a tight bun that made her look older and more serious, and drove to the federal courthouse downtown. The building was imposing, all concrete and glass and security checkpoints that took 20 minutes to clear. Flynn met her in the lobby and escorted her to conference room 6, where the prosecutor was waiting. Assistant District Attorney Michelle Torres was in her 40s, sharp-eyed and efficient, with the kind of presence that suggested she didn't waste time on pleasantries. She shook Sarah's hand once and got straight to business. "The grand jury will hear from you first," Torres said, spreading files across the conference table. "I'll walk you through your documentation, establish your credentials, and your timeline. The defense isn't present for grand jury, but assume everything you say will be used to prepare their case for trial." "Understood. Your psych eval came back clean. Dr. Reeves found no evidence that PTSD affected your clinical judgment. That's good, but the defense will still try to use your military service against you." Torres pulled out a transcript. "This is from Kramer's lawyer's statement to the press this morning. She's claiming you have a pattern of seeing authority figures as threats and that your combat experience made you hypersensitive to use of force." Sarah read the statement, feeling anger build with each word. "That's not just wrong. It's insulting to every veteran who serves and comes home to work in healthcare." "I agree, but we need to address it head on. When they ask about your military service, acknowledge it. Own it. Explain that battlefield medicine taught you to document accurately because lives depend on accurate information. Don't let them make your training sound like a liability." They spent the next hour rehearsing questions and answers. Torres was relentless, pushing Sarah harder than any defense attorney could, finding weaknesses in her testimony and showing her how to shore them up. By the time they finished, Sarah felt wrung out, but prepared. At 10 a.m., she was sworn in before the grand jury, 23 citizens sitting in a room that felt more like a classroom than a courtroom. Torres asked her questions in a clear, methodical voice. Sarah answered with the same clinical precision she'd used when documenting injuries, walking the jury through case after case, patient after patient, showing them the pattern that emerged when someone finally bothered to look. She testified for 90 minutes. When she finished, the jury foreman asked if she had anything to add. Sarah looked at the 23 faces staring back at her. Regular people. The kind of people who went to Riverside General when they got hurt. The kind of people who trusted that the system worked. "I documented what I saw because that's my job," Sarah said quietly. "Not because I had an agenda or because I wanted to be a hero. I documented it because patients told me they were hurt and I believed them. And I testified today because Diana Price and Marcus Webb and all the others deserved better than what they got. They deserved a system that protected them instead of punishing them for speaking up." The room was silent when she finished. Torres walked her out after the session ended. "You did well. The jury will deliberate this afternoon and we should have an indictment by end of day. And then? Then the real work begins: trial prep, depositions, building a case strong enough that Kramer's lawyers can't punch holes in it. Torres paused at the courthouse exit. Sarah, I need you to understand something. Getting an indictment is the easy part. Grand juries indict almost everyone. The trial is where cases fall apart, where witnesses get scared or discredited, where juries decide that reasonable doubt means siding with the cop. I know. Do you? Because the conviction rate for police officers charged with assault is less than 30%. The system is designed to protect them, to give them every benefit of every doubt. Torres met her eyes. I believe we can win this, but belief isn't the same as certainty. Sarah thought about the parking lot confrontation with Kramer, about his absolute conviction that he would walk, about the 15 years of getting away with violence that had taught him the system would always protect him. Then we make certainty, Sarah said. Torres smiled slightly. I like you, Mitchell. Let's go make certainty. Sarah left the courthouse and drove back across the city, her hands shaking slightly on the steering wheel. She'd testified. She'd faced the grand jury and told the truth and survived. It should have felt like a victory. Instead, it felt like she'd just painted the biggest target possible on her back, and now all she could do was wait to see who took the shot. Her phone buzzed with a text from Flynn. Grand jury returned indictment. Kramer formally charged with federal civil rights violations, assault, obstruction, conspiracy. Arraignment. Monday. Another text followed immediately. Also, we found the leak. It was hospital security guard named Paul Vincent. He's been feeding information to Kramer's defense team in exchange for cash. He's been arrested. Sarah read the messages twice. The leak was plugged. Kramer was indicted. The pieces were falling into place. So why did she feel like something was about to go terribly wrong? She got her answer that night when Agent Ross called at 11 p.m., her voice tight with barely controlled fury. Dr. Webb is dead. Suicide, apparently. He hanged himself in his garage 3 hours ago, left a note saying he couldn't live with the guilt of falsifying medical records. Sarah felt the floor tilt. That's not... He was going to testify? I know, and now he can't. His confession is still admissible, but without him on the stand to corroborate your documentation, the defense gets to argue he was coerced, that the FBI pressured a respected physician into making false statements. Ross paused. Sarah, this wasn't suicide. Webb was our second strongest witness after you. Someone made sure he couldn't testify. Kramer's in custody. He couldn't have... Kramer has friends. We knew that. We just didn't know how far they'd go to protect him. Sarah sat down hard on her couch, the phone pressed to her ear. Webb was dead. The man who'd enabled Kramer for 3 years, who'd finally found the courage to confess, was gone, and his death would be used to undermine everything he'd testified about. What happens now? Sarah asked. Now we investigate the suicide and try to prove it was murder. But Sarah, you need to understand that you just became the case. You're the primary witness now. Everything depends on whether the jury believes you. Ross hung up and Sarah sat in her dark apartment, surrounded by silence and the weight of what she'd just been told. Everything depended on her, on whether 12 strangers would believe a nurse with 8 months at one hospital over a cop with 15 years of service and friends willing to kill to protect him. Sarah stood and walked to her window, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Kramer was sitting in a cell, knowing that his people had just eliminated a key witness, knowing that the case against him had gotten weaker, probably smiling. Sarah pulled out her laptop and opened her documentation files. If she was going to be the case, if everything was going to come down to her testimony, then she needed to be ready. She spent the next 3 hours reviewing every chart, every notation, every detail that she'd documented over 8 months. At 2 a.m., her secure phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number that had somehow bypassed the FBI's security. Sarah almost deleted it. Then she saw the first line and her blood went cold. The message contained a photograph of Kelly Rodriguez leaving Riverside General after her shift. Another photo of Tom Bradley getting into his car. A third photo of Sarah's apartment building, taken from across the street showing her window. Below the photos was a single sentence. Some witnesses testify, some witnesses disappear. Choose wisely. Sarah stared at the photos on her phone screen, her hands steady despite the rage burning through her chest. They'd miscalculated. Whoever sent these images thought fear would make her back down, thought threatening her colleagues would break her the way threatening Jennifer Santos had worked. They didn't understand that Sarah Mitchell had spent 3 years in Kandahar learning that the only way through fear was straight ahead. She screenshotted the message, forwarded it to Flynn and Torres, then called Flynn directly. He answered on the second ring, his voice rough with sleep. "They just threatened Kelly and Tom," Sarah said without preamble. "Sent photos of them leaving work, photos of my apartment. They want me to know they can reach anyone connected to me. I'm sending protective details now." "No, you're not." Sarah's voice was cold and clear. "You're going to trace that message, find out who sent it, and add witness intimidation to the charges. And I'm going to testify on Monday exactly like I planned. Sarah, if they're willing to kill Webb, then they're desperate, which means we're winning." Sarah walked to her window and looked out at the parking lot where Kramer had confronted her just hours ago. They wouldn't be threatening people if they thought they could win in court. They're trying to scare me off because I'm all they have left to attack. Flynn was quiet for a moment. "You're right. But that doesn't make you less of a target. I've been a target since the first time I documented one of Kramer's arrests. The only difference now is that I'm done pretending I'm not." Sarah pulled the curtains shut. "Trace the message. Find whoever sent it. And Flynn? I want to know by morning." She hung up before he could argue and spent the rest of the night reviewing her testimony one more time. When dawn broke gray and cold over Riverside, Sarah had been awake for 26 hours and had every detail of her documentation memorized. Flynn called at 7 a.m. "We traced the message. It came from a burner phone registered to a shell company that's owned by a lawyer named Marcus Donnelly. He's not Kramer's defense attorney, but he's connected, represents half the police union, and has a reputation for making problems disappear." "Can you prove he sent it?" "We're working on it. In the meantime, he's been brought in for questioning." Flynn paused. "Sarah, Donnelly's involvement means this goes deeper than we thought. He doesn't get involved unless there's serious money or serious exposure at stake. How deep are we talking?" Torres thinks the corruption investigation Diana Price was part of might have involved union funds, possibly embezzlement, possibly kickbacks. If Kramer was the enforcer keeping witnesses quiet, Donnelly might have been the one coordinating it. Flynn's voice hardened. Which means taking down Kramer could expose the entire network. Sarah felt something click into place. That's why they killed Webb. Not just to weaken the case, but to send a message to anyone else thinking about cooperating. Exactly. Which is why Torres wants to meet with you this morning before the arraignment. She's going to offer you one more chance to reconsider testifying. Tell her I'll be there at 9, and tell her my answer is no. Sarah arrived at the federal courthouse at 8:45 wearing the same dark suit and carrying a folder with copies of every piece of documentation she'd created over 8 months. Torres was waiting in conference room 6 with Flynn and 2 other FBI agents Sarah didn't recognize. "These are Agents Martinez and Stone," Torres said. "They've been investigating the corruption case that Diana Price was testifying about. They need to hear what you know." For the next hour, Sarah walked them through every arrest Kramer had made that she'd documented, every connection she could remember between patients and the wider investigation. Agent Martinez took notes while Stone pulled up files on his laptop, cross-referencing names and dates. 7 of your documented cases were witnesses in our corruption probe, Stone said finally. 3 are dead. 2 recanted testimony. 1 disappeared. Only Jennifer Santos is still willing to testify, and only because you got her into protective custody before they could threaten her into silence. Who's they? Sarah asked. We're still building the full picture, but we know Donnelly's involved. We know at least 3 other officers helped Kramer target witnesses. And we know someone high up in the police department has been running interference to keep investigations from gaining traction. Stone looked at Torres. If Mitchell testifies and the jury believes her, it opens the door for us to prosecute the entire network. Torres leaned back in her chair. Which is why I need to ask you one more time, Sarah. Are you absolutely certain you want to do this? Because once you take that stand, you become the biggest threat to some very powerful people who've already proven they're willing to kill. Sarah thought about Diana Price dying alone in a cell, about Marcus Webb's sister clutching a photograph, about Jennifer Santos's 9-year-old sister being threatened because her older sister had tried to tell the truth. I'm certain, Sarah said. The arraignment was scheduled for 2 p.m. Sarah spent the intervening hours in a secure conference room protected by federal agents who checked every person who came near the corridor. At 1:30, Torres came to get her. The courthouse is locked down. Press is outside, but they won't get near you. Kramer's being brought in through the prisoner entrance. Torres handed Sarah a visitor badge. You don't have to be there for this. The arraignment is just a formality. He'll plead not guilty and we'll set a trial date. I want to be there, Sarah said. I want him to see me. They walked through the courthouse together, Torres in front and Agent Ross behind, moving through corridors that had been cleared of everyone except federal personnel. The courtroom was small, built for arraignments and preliminary hearings, with space for maybe 50 people. The gallery was packed, reporters, federal agents, police officers in uniform who'd come to show support for Kramer. Sarah sat in the front row behind the prosecution table. She kept her eyes forward as the room filled, refusing to look at the officers who stared at her with open hostility, refusing to acknowledge the whispered comments about traitors and liars. At 2 p.m. exactly, a door opened and Ryan Kramer was led into the courtroom in handcuffs and an orange jumpsuit. He looked smaller somehow, diminished without his uniform and badge. His eyes swept the courtroom and landed on Sarah. She met his gaze and didn't look away. The judge entered and the bailiff called the court to order. The charges were read: federal civil rights violations, assault under color of authority, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to interfere with a federal investigation. Each charge carried years in prison. Combined, they could mean decades. Kramer's new lawyer, not the nervous woman from before, but an older man with silver hair and an expensive suit, entered a plea of not guilty. The judge set bail at $5 million, which even the police union couldn't cover. Kramer would stay in custody until trial. Trial date is set for January 15th, the judge said. Prosecution will submit witness lists by December 1st. Defense will have 2 weeks to respond. Any motions should be filed. Your Honor, Torres stood. The prosecution would like to add additional charges based on evidence that emerged over the weekend. We have proof that defendant coordinated with attorney Marcus Donnelly to intimidate and threaten federal witnesses, including threatening family members of cooperating witnesses. The courtroom erupted. Kramer's lawyer was on his feet objecting. The judge was banging his gavel. Police officers in the gallery were shouting. Through it all, Sarah sat perfectly still, watching Kramer's face as he realized the walls were closing in. The judge called for order, and the room slowly quieted. Ms. Torres, do you have evidence to support these additional charges? We do, Your Honor, including text messages, financial records showing payments from Donnelly to individuals who carried out intimidation, and testimony from witnesses who were threatened. Torres pulled out a file. We're also prepared to demonstrate that this conspiracy extends beyond defendant Kramer to multiple other officers and officials. The judge studied the file for a long moment. Additional charges are approved. Mr. Kramer, you're also charged with witness tampering and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Bail is revoked entirely. Trial date stands. He banged the gavel. We're adjourned. Kramer was led out of the courtroom, but not before he turned one last time to stare at Sarah. The hatred in his eyes was pure and absolute. Sarah stared back until he disappeared through the prisoner door. Torres touched her shoulder. Come on, let's get you out of here before the press descends. They made it halfway down the courthouse steps before the reporters caught up. Microphones were shoved in Sarah's face. Questions were shouted from every direction. Ms. Mitchell, how do you respond to accusations that you fabricated evidence? Ms. Mitchell, are you working with the FBI to target police officers? Ms. Mitchell, do you feel responsible for Dr. Webb's death? Sarah stopped walking. Torres tried to pull her forward, but Sarah gently extracted her arm and turned to face the cameras. I documented injuries on patients who told me they were hurt, Sarah said clearly. I did my job as a nurse the way I was trained to do it, with accuracy and compassion. If that documentation exposed corruption, if it revealed that people in positions of authority were abusing that authority, then the problem isn't with the documentation. The problem is with the abuse. But you're asking a jury to believe you over-decorated police officers. I'm asking a jury to look at medical evidence and decide for themselves what it shows. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I'm asking them to believe the facts. Sarah paused. Diana Price died in custody. Marcus Webb died 3 months after being beaten during arrest. Dr. Webb died under suspicious circumstances just days before he was set to testify. Those are facts. What the jury does with those facts is up to them. She turned and walked away before anyone could ask another question. The trial began on a freezing Monday in mid-January. Sarah had spent the intervening months in depositions and prep sessions, reviewing her documentation until she could recite it in her sleep. Kelly Rodriguez and Tom Bradley had both been called as character witnesses. Jennifer Santos was scheduled to testify about her own arrest and the threats that followed. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Torres walked the jury through each documented case, showing them photos of injuries and arrest reports that didn't match. She played surveillance footage of Kramer visiting Diana Price hours before her death. She presented financial records showing Marcus Donnelly had paid off hospital security guards and other officials to help cover up abuse. Sarah testified on day 4. She spent 6 hours on the stand walking the jury through her documentation with the same clinical precision she'd used when creating it. The defense attorney tried to rattle her, tried to make her angry or defensive or uncertain. Sarah answered every question calmly, referring to her notes when necessary, admitting when she didn't know something rather than speculating. "Isn't it true you were suspended from Riverside General for insubordination?" the defense attorney asked on cross-examination. "I was suspended after I questioned a medical clearance decision that I believed put a patient at risk," Sarah replied. That suspension was later rescinded when the FBI investigation revealed the patient in question had been systematically abused. "But you have a history of conflict with authority figures." "I have a history of advocating for patients. If that conflicts with authority figures who prioritize convenience over care, then yes, I suppose I do." The trial lasted 3 weeks. Jennifer Santos testified and didn't break under cross-examination. Kelly Rodriguez testified about the culture of silence at Riverside General. Agent Stone testified about the wider corruption investigation and how Kramer had been used as an enforcer to keep witnesses quiet. Marcus Donnelly was arrested during week 2 and immediately began cooperating, providing names and evidence in exchange for a reduced sentence. By week 3, 5 other police officers had been suspended, and 2 officials in the prosecutor's office were under investigation. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, Sarah was sitting in the gallery between Kelly and Tom. She watched Kramer stand as the verdict was read. Guilty on all counts. The courtroom was silent except for one officer in the back who got up and left, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor. Sentencing came 3 weeks later. Ryan Kramer received 23 years in federal prison. Marcus Donnelly got 15 years. The other officers involved received sentences ranging from 5 to 12 years. Sarah sat through the entire sentencing hearing and felt nothing except tired relief. It was over. The man who'd terrorized witnesses and corrupted a system meant to protect people would spend the next 2 decades in prison. It wasn't justice for Diana Price or Marcus Webb, not really. Nothing could bring them back. But it was accountability. And sometimes accountability was the only justice possible. 6 months after Kramer's conviction, Sarah stood in a conference room at Riverside General wearing a new title badge, Director of Patient Advocacy and Clinical Ethics. The hospital board had created the position specifically for her after a comprehensive review revealed systemic failures in how the ER handled police custody cases. "Your job is to make sure what happened with Kramer never happens again," the board chair had told her during the interview. "We need someone who won't back down when pressured, someone who puts patients first." Sarah had accepted the position with one condition: that Kelly Rodriguez and Tom Bradley be promoted to senior nursing roles with authority to override physicians when patient safety was at risk. The board had agreed. Now Sarah stood in front of a room full of nurses and doctors, teaching them about documentation, advocacy, and the responsibility they all carried to see patients as human beings rather than problems to be processed. "You'll face pressure to stay silent," Sarah told them. "Pressure from supervisors who want things to run smoothly. Pressure from law enforcement who want compliant witnesses to their version of events. Pressure from colleagues who think you're making their lives harder." She paused. "But you'll also see things that nobody else sees. Injuries that tell a different story than the official report. Patients who are scared to speak up because they don't think anyone will believe them. And when you see those things, you have a choice. Document what you observe and let the facts speak, or look away and let the abuse continue." A young nurse in the front row raised her hand. What if documenting what we see costs us our jobs? It might, Sarah said honestly. It might cost you professionally. It might make you enemies. It might put you in situations where you have to choose between convenience and doing what's right. She thought about the 8 months she'd spent feeling powerless at this same hospital. But I can tell you from experience that the cost of staying silent is higher, because you'll carry every patient you failed, every person you could have helped but didn't, for the rest of your career, and that weight never gets lighter. The training session ended and nurses filed out, some looking thoughtful, others looking skeptical. Sarah packed up her materials and walked through the ER where she'd spent 8 months documenting abuse that everyone else ignored. It looked different now. The same trauma bays, the same equipment, but the atmosphere had shifted. Nurses asked questions instead of accepting physician orders without comment. Security guards were required to undergo training about patient rights. A new protocol required any patient in police custody to be evaluated by 2 separate providers, with mandatory reporting of any injuries inconsistent with arrest reports. It wasn't perfect. Systems never were. But it was better. And better was worth fighting for. Sarah was leaving through the main entrance when she saw a woman standing near the information desk, holding a photograph and looking lost. Sarah recognized her immediately, Marcus Webb's sister, the one who'd thanked her in the parking lot all those months ago. "Can I help you?" Sarah asked. The woman looked up and recognition flashed across her face. "Ms. Mitchell, I was hoping I'd see you. I wanted to tell you that they're reopening Marcus's case. The police department is investigating his death as a potential homicide now, based on the evidence that came out during Kramer's trial." "I'm glad," Sarah said quietly. "It won't bring him back, but it means something that someone's finally looking at what really happened." The woman hesitated. "I also wanted to say thank you for not giving up, for testifying even when it was dangerous. Marcus would have—" Her voice broke. "He would have been proud that someone finally stood up." Sarah didn't know what to say to that. She'd testified because it was the right thing to do, because patients deserved advocates who wouldn't back down. She hadn't done it for gratitude or recognition. But standing in the hospital lobby with Marcus Webb's sister, seeing the grief and relief warring on her face, Sarah understood that documentation and testimony and accountability mattered in ways beyond courtrooms and verdicts. They mattered because they told people their pain was real, that their stories deserved to be heard, that they weren't invisible. "I'm sorry I couldn't do more while he was alive," Sarah said. "You did what you could with what you had. That's all anyone can do." The woman smiled sadly. "Take care of yourself, Ms. Mitchell, and keep doing what you're doing. The world needs more people like you." She walked away and Sarah stood in the lobby for a long moment, watching people come and go through the emergency department entrance. Patients seeking care, families seeking answers, nurses and doctors trying to help in a system that didn't always make it easy to help. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Kelly. "New custody case just came in. Patient says officer used excessive force during arrest. Need you to review the documentation when you have a minute?" Sarah texted back, "On my way." She walked back through the ER entrance, past the security desk, into the controlled chaos of a Tuesday afternoon in a Level 2 trauma center. She didn't know if the new patient's claims would be substantiated, didn't know if this would be another case that exposed abuse or a legitimate arrest that resulted in accidental injury. But she would document what she observed. She would listen to what the patient told her, and she would make sure that this time, when someone spoke up about mistreatment, there would be people in positions of authority who were willing to hear them. Because Sarah Mitchell had learned something during 8 months of feeling powerless and 6 months of fighting back. Systems only protected people when individuals inside those systems chose to act. Policies meant nothing without people willing to enforce them. Justice was impossible without someone willing to stand up and demand it. She'd been the nurse they tried to silence, the witness they tried to intimidate, the person nobody expected to matter. And she'd proven that quiet people could roar when they finally stopped accepting that their voices didn't count. That documentation could be devastating when it was honest. That one person choosing to do the right thing could start a cascade that brought down an entire corrupt network. Sarah pushed through the doors into Bay 7, where Kelly was waiting with a patient chart and a concerned expression. "What do we have?" Sarah asked. Kelly handed her the chart. 26-year-old male, arrested for public intoxication, says the arresting officer slammed his head against the patrol car. Head CT is pending, but he's got significant bruising and what looks like a concussion. Sarah scanned the arrest report. The officer claimed the patient had resisted and fallen. The injuries didn't match that story. "Let's document everything," Sarah said. "Photos, patient statement, timeline. Do it right." Kelly nodded and they got to work. 2 nurses in a busy emergency department, making sure that this patient's story would be heard, making sure that documentation would speak when fear tried to silence truth. Outside the hospital windows, Riverside's winter rain continued to fall. But inside Bay 7, under fluorescent lights that had witnessed too much suffering and too little accountability, Sarah Mitchell was doing what she'd always done, seeing patients as human beings, believing their pain was real, and refusing to stay quiet when power demanded silence. She wasn't a hero. She was just a nurse who'd learned that sometimes the most revolutionary act was simply doing your job with integrity when everyone around you had decided integrity was too expensive. And in a world where systems protected the powerful and dismissed the vulnerable, that made all the difference.